The wind screamed across the high desert sky as two massive bombers closed in on each other. Too close. Their propellers roared in perfect sync, barely 50 feet apart, the air between them tearing and twisting like an invisible storm. At 14,000 feet, over a dry test range in 1943, one of the bombers carried something no aircraft had ever flown with before. A long metal hose snaking from its belly, trailing in the wind. The second bomber crept closer, its pilot sweating, eyes locked on the wobbling line that danced between them like a live wire. This wasn't combat. There were no guns, no enemy in sight. Yet everyone aboard knew. One wrong move, and both planes would be gone in seconds. The flight engineer's hand trembled over the intercom. "Steady, steady," the second pilot replied, his voice calm but tight. "Copy that. Coming in." For a few agonizing moments, the two four-engine giants hovered in parallel, prop wash buffeting their wings, air pressure slamming their fuselages. The hose swung closer, caught in the slipstream, missed the receiver port by inches. Again and again. And then, contact. A dull metallic clink. The hose latched. The fuel valves opened. A thin vibration ran through both aircraft as liquid gasoline began to flow between them, in midair. For the first time in history, one bomber was refueling another while still flying. No one cheered. No one spoke. They were too stunned to believe it was real. Because this was 1943, a time when even the idea of refueling in flight was considered impossible. Jet engines didn't exist yet. Computers didn't exist yet. The world was still at war. And yet, inside a classified hangar in Kansas, a small group of American engineers had spent months preparing for this moment. A test so secret, it didn't officially exist. They called it Operation Tip Tank. Its goal? To give American bombers something their enemies didn't think was possible: limitless range. What began as a desperate experiment on paper was now happening in the sky. And if it worked, it could change the very nature of air power forever. But no one outside that crew would know what they'd done. Not for decades. Because this wasn't a headline or a battlefield victory. This was something quieter. Something hidden. The birth of flight without end. By 1943, the skies of the world were filled with American bombers. B-17s thundered over Europe. B-24s rumbled across the Pacific. And the dream of striking deep into enemy territory had finally become reality. Or so it seemed. But there was one problem no amount of courage could overcome. Range. Every mission, no matter how daring, was shackled by fuel. Even the mighty B-24 Liberator, America's longest-legged bomber, could barely reach Berlin from England and return. In the Pacific, where ocean distances swallowed islands whole, the limits were worse. Entire targets were simply too far to reach. Commanders tried everything: extra tanks, stripped armor, new flight routes. But the math never changed. Fuel dictated power. And as the war stretched across continents, America's airmen were learning a bitter truth. No matter how advanced the plane, a bomber was still a prisoner of its own fuel lines. That's when a handful of engineers, dreamers more than soldiers, asked the question no one else dared. What if a bomber never had to land to refuel? To most, it sounded absurd. To the U.S. Army Air Forces, it sounded like a waste of money. But to a few men buried deep inside Boeing's research division, it was the key to something far greater. A new kind of warfare. They called it in-flight refueling, and it wasn't entirely new. Back in the 1920s, barnstormers had tried it with buckets and hoses, dangling from cockpits in stunt shows. But those were circus tricks, not combat systems. Now, in the middle of a world war, America wanted to make it real, to build a machine that could safely refuel another aircraft in motion, in turbulence, at war speeds. If they could succeed, bombers could fly from American soil to Berlin, Tokyo, or beyond, without ever landing. It would mean freedom from distance itself. But first, they had to prove it could be done. And for that, they needed a test bed, something big, durable, and expendable. The answer came in the form of a modified B-24 Liberator, and later, the heavy Boeing B-29, converted into a flying fuel tanker. They would be linked together by nothing but metal hoses, fragile valves, and a few inches of air. It was called Operation Tip Tank, a classified series of test flights buried in the American Midwest, hidden behind the noise of war headlines. There were no medals promised, no press coverage, no official acknowledgement. Just a handful of engineers, test pilots, and mechanics trying to change physics with their bare hands. They knew if it failed, no one would ever know their names. But if it worked, it would change the course of air power for the next century. And so, in the bitter winter of 1943, the first of those secret flights was prepared. Fuel drums were rolled out, the hoses were tested, and 2 crews were briefed on a mission that didn't officially exist. They weren't told to bomb. They weren't told to fight. They were told to do something far more dangerous, to fly side by side, closer than any bombers ever had before, and not die trying. They worked in shadows, behind hangar doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." While the rest of America followed battlefronts in Europe and the Pacific, these men were fighting a quieter war against turbulence, gravity, and time itself. Their names rarely made it into reports. Men like John Paul Stapp, a flight surgeon obsessed with air endurance; Robert Thurlow, an engineer who believed distance was the new weapon; and a handful of Boeing and Army Air Forces mechanics who volunteered for the tests even after seeing what could go wrong. Because things did go wrong, horribly wrong. The first trials were disasters. Fuel hoses snapped mid-flight and whipped back like steel serpents, tearing through tail fins. Pressure valves jammed. Fuel spilled in open air, igniting into bursts that nearly roasted the crews alive. One engineer wrote in his logbook, "Every success begins with the smell of gasoline and fear." Yet they refused to stop. Each failure taught them something new. Each mistake brought them closer to control. They realized that the true enemy wasn't the machinery, it was the air itself. The slipstream between 2 giant bombers created a deadly pocket of chaos. Flying close enough to connect a hose meant entering a zone of violent pressure waves where wings shook, engines coughed, and one wrong move could mean collision. So they practiced again and again. They flew so close that crews could see each other's faces through the cockpit glass. They developed hand signals, then radio codes, then special markings on fuselages to help line up mid-flight. Each time, they risked everything, and each time, they came a little closer. By early 1944, the experiments were moving beyond prototypes. They now had 2 modified aircraft, 1 tanker with fuel tanks fitted inside its bomb bay, and 1 receiver bomber with a refueling port mounted on its nose. From a distance, they looked like ordinary B-29s. Up close, they were something entirely new. Their goal wasn't speed, it wasn't altitude, it was endurance. The ability to keep flying, to never stop. The pilots called it flying the edge. The engineers called it progress. And though the world would never know their faces, their work was quietly transforming aviation from within. One officer later said, "They weren't soldiers. They were dreamers with wrenches, and they were fighting for the future." As the tests improved, word began to spread within the Air Force's upper circles. Rumors of a new kind of flight. A flight that didn't end. A flight that could reach anywhere on Earth. No one believed it. Not yet. But soon, they would. Because the next test would succeed. And it would change everything. February 1944. A frozen morning at a remote Kansas airfield. The wind cut across the tarmac as two massive aircraft stood nose to nose. One stripped of its guns and filled with fuel tanks. The other modified to receive that fuel through a fragile metal coupling fixed beneath its nose. The men who stepped aboard knew what this meant. They weren't going into battle, but they could still die like they were. One slip, one jolt, one spark, and two fully loaded bombers would become a fireball in the sky. The mission was simple on paper: connect, transfer, survive. The lead pilot, Captain Fred Park, had been briefed dozens of times. Stay steady, no sudden movements, maintain formation at 190 miles per hour. His co-pilot looked over his shoulder and muttered, "We're trying to make two flying gas stations shake hands in a hurricane." At 10:14 a.m., the tanker's engines roared to life. Moments later, the receiver bomber followed, lifting off into the pale Kansas sky. As they climbed, radio silence fell. Each crew member felt the tension press into their chest. No one spoke, except the flight engineer counting down fuel pressure levels. At 12,000 feet, the planes aligned, one slightly above and ahead, the other just below and behind. From the belly of the tanker, the hose began to unspool. It whipped and jerked in the air, a silver snake caught in a storm. "Easy, easy," Park whispered into his headset. The receiver aircraft nudged closer, its nose steady as the hose wavered within reach. Wind buffeted the wings. The distance between the two bombers narrowed to just 30 feet. The crews could see each other's faces, eyes wide, hands trembling on throttles. Then, contact. A sharp clang echoed through both aircraft. The hose locked into the refueling port. "Contact confirmed!" shouted the engineer. Fuel began to flow, slowly, almost uncertainly. For one glorious minute, it worked. A steady vibration hummed through the fuselages as fuel transferred mid-air, the first in history between two heavy bombers. They had done it. They had defied gravity's rulebook. And then, disaster. A sudden downdraft slammed the tanker's wing. The hose snapped loose, whipping back into the receiver's fuselage. Metal screeched. The pilot yanked his controls. The two planes lurched apart, barely missing collision by seconds. The engineer shouted, "Break off! Break off!" The sky fell silent again, except for the pounding of engines and hearts. Both bombers limped home, one with a torn fuselage, the other trailing vaporized fuel behind it. On the ground, they stepped out shaking, covered in sweat. They'd nearly died. But amid the fear and the smell of scorched fuel, one thing was clear. For 60 seconds, the impossible had worked. And in those 60 seconds, they'd glimpsed the future of flight. That night, one engineer stayed late, sketching diagrams by the dim glow of a desk lamp. He scribbled a note in the margin: "Needs refinement, but it can be done." It wasn't triumph yet, but it was proof. The next attempt would be different. It would be the one that succeeded and changed aviation forever. Spring, 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but in the Pacific, the skies still burned. Every mile over the ocean meant danger and distance. B-29 crews flying from the Marianas to Japan knew it. Fuel wasn't just a number. It was the thin line between returning home or vanishing into the waves. At Wright Field, a small team of engineers gathered once again around a new design. A refueling boom, this time rigid, controllable, and precise. No whipping hose, no chaos. Just a metal arm, guided by a second pilot in the tail of the tanker. They called it the flying boom. The man behind the redesign, Boeing engineer R.W. Robbie Robbins, believed the idea could finally make mid-air refueling safe and repeatable. To test it, they built a pair of modified aircraft, a B-29 tanker and another as receiver. Both bristled with cables, gauges, and experimental hydraulics. This was no stunt. It was a blueprint for the future. April 1945, the test flight. The tanker lifted off first, smooth and steady. Behind it, the receiver bomber climbed through the clouds, its crew silent, eyes locked on the silver aircraft ahead. "Maintain distance at 30 feet, Robbins said over the radio. "Boom operator, take control." From the tanker's rear compartment, the operator peered through a small window, joystick in hand. The boom extended, its fins trembling in the slipstream. He inched it closer. One tap, then another. Contact. Fuel flow confirmed. No sparks, no fire, no panic. The B-29s flew locked together for 10 full minutes, longer than anyone thought possible. Then 15, then 20. "Transfer complete," came the call. Both aircraft detached cleanly, engines still humming in unison. Cheers erupted through the intercom. The impossible had become routine. That evening, Robbins wrote in his report, "Demonstrated controlled aerial fuel transfer at 15,000 feet. Full success." The Air Force brass took notice. Within months, the concept evolved into Operation Tip Tank, and soon the KB-29M became the world's first operational aerial tanker. A quiet revolution had begun, one that would stretch across decades. Every future bomber, every long-range jet, every global mission America would fly. All of it would trace its lineage back to that spring day, when two B-29s danced through the air, sharing lifeblood between their wings. As the sun dipped below the Kansas horizon, one pilot turned to his co-pilot and smiled. "We just gave airplanes the power to never stop flying." And he was right. That experiment didn't just refuel bombers. It refueled the imagination of flight itself. By late 1948, the project that began as a whisper in a Kansas hangar had become the beating heart of America's new air strategy. The world was changing. The Cold War was dawning, and distance, once a limitation, was now a weapon. The Air Force had just been born as a separate branch, and its visionaries saw something others didn't. A future where bombers would no longer be chained to bases or oceans. If they could refuel mid-air, they could strike anywhere, anytime. Boeing's engineers were ordered to take their wartime experiment and make it permanent. The result was the KB-29P, the first truly operational refueling tanker with a fully functional flying boom. The same design first tested in secret. Its role was simple: feed the sky. By 1949, these tankers were deployed in trial missions with the Strategic Air Command. Their goal was clear: prove that bombers could cross the world without landing once. The first long-range test stunned even the skeptics. A B-50 Superfortress, named Lucky Lady 2, took off from Fort Worth, Texas. Over the course of 94 hours, it circled the globe, refueling 4 times mid-air, and landed back where it started. The mission was classified until completion. When it landed, General Curtis LeMay himself was waiting. He said just 6 words that would echo for generations. "Gentlemen, we own the skies now." That flight wasn't just a record, it was a declaration. A message to the world that America had achieved something no nation had dared even imagine during the war: unlimited range. Every future mission, from Cold War deterrence to global humanitarian airlifts, would depend on the concept born from that dangerous 1943 experiment. Behind every jet that crossed an ocean without pause, every bomber that struck a target halfway around the world, was the invisible handshake between two aircraft, a tanker and a receiver, bound by a few feet of metal and trust. From the roaring B-29s to the sleek KC-135s and KC-46 of today, the lineage is unbroken. And yet few remember that it all started with men in leather jackets, experimenting in secret with hoses and prayer. What began as the secret American experiment to refuel bombers mid-air became the silent engine of modern air power. As the historian Robert K. Wilcox later wrote, America didn't just conquer the air, it learned how to stay there. And that's the story of how engineers, not generals, gave the United States Air Force the wings to never land again. By the 1950s, the flying boom had gone from an experimental sketch to an icon of the jet age. Wherever American bombers went, the tankers followed, silent, unseen, but essential. The KC-97, with its distinctive high wings and lumbering engines, became the first true workhorse of the Strategic Air Command. Its mission was constant: climb to altitude, orbit patiently, and feed the bombers that stood guard over the free world. For the crews, it was a strange kind of duty. Long hours, no glory, no headlines. But they knew the truth. Without them, the bombers were powerless. Captain James "Red" Martin, a KC-97 pilot, once told Air and Space magazine, "We weren't the sharp end of the spear. We were the arm that held it up." Then came the jet age, and with it, the KC-135 Stratotanker, Boeing's sleek new refueling giant. Powered by 4 jet engines, it could keep pace with supersonic bombers and fighters. Its reliability and reach made it the backbone of American air strategy from the Cold War through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Every mission, from nuclear deterrence patrols to humanitarian airlifts, depended on the quiet professionalism of tanker crews. They operated in near silence, often in bad weather, sometimes under enemy threat, performing one of aviation's most precise and dangerous maneuvers, connecting 2 jets flying hundreds of miles per hour, only yards apart. The public rarely noticed, but the pilots who relied on them never forgot. "If you're running low on fuel at 30,000 feet, said one fighter pilot, and you see that KC-135 on the horizon, it's the most beautiful sight in the world." The evolution didn't stop there. Today, the KC-46 Pegasus continues the legacy, equipped with advanced sensors, automatic booms, and digital flight controls. But the principle remains unchanged from that 1943 experiment. 2 aircraft, 1 trust, and the lifeline that keeps them both aloft. What began as a desperate wartime experiment became the very definition of global reach. Without refueling tankers, modern warfare, global relief operations, even transcontinental air power, all of it would collapse. It is a story few tell, yet every flight across the world is a quiet echo of it. An unbroken line from a Kansas airfield to every corner of the sky. And in that legacy lies something far greater than machinery. The courage of engineers who dared to ask, what if planes never had to land? March 1957. At an airbase in Kansas, a KC-135 Stratotanker rose into the morning light for its first official flight. Below, the Boeing engineers who had spent years refining the aerial refueling system stood in silence, watching their creation ascend, a symbol of everything they'd risked to prove a dream. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. From that day on, refueling aircraft would become as vital to American power as the bombers and fighters they sustained. During the Cold War, KC-135s flew endless orbits, keeping nuclear-armed bombers in the sky 24 hours a day. In Vietnam, tankers refueled F-105s and Phantoms mid-combat, giving them the reach to strike deep and return home. In Desert Storm, they turned a 90-minute sortie into an 8-hour mission, refueling jets as they raced across Iraqi skies. Every war, every peacekeeping mission, every show of strength since, all depended on a quiet, steady hand guiding a boom into position thousands of feet above the earth. But beyond the military, that invention reshaped aviation itself. Commercial jets studied its technology. Global flight routes expanded because of the lessons learned from those first B-29 tests. And today, satellites, drones, even future space missions owe a conceptual debt to that single question asked in 1943. Can we keep flying forever? No monument marks the men who risked their lives testing the first systems. No parade celebrates the refueling crews who operate unseen in the clouds. But every pilot who ever reached home with fuel to spare knows who to thank. The experiment that began in wartime secrecy became the foundation of a new kind of freedom, a world where no destination is too far and no horizon too distant. In the words of one Air Force historian, it wasn't the bomb or the jet that made America a global power. It was the tanker, the machine that gave wings to endurance. And so, the story of mid-air refueling isn't just a tale of engineering. It's a testament to belief. The belief that flight could be limitless. From that single spark in 1943 to the skies of today, one truth remains constant. The dream of never having to land changed the sky forever. If this story interested you, subscribe and give it a like to help others discover real World War II history.